This is the greatest handgun ever made. The Colt single-action army. 6 bullets. More than enough to kill anything that moves.
The Colt Single Action Army, also known as the Single Action Army, the SAA, Model P, Peacemaker, and M1873, is a single-action revolver with a revolving cylinder holding 6 metallic cartridges. It was designed for the U.S. government's service revolver trials of 1872 by Colt's patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, today's Colt Manufacturing Company, and was adopted as a standard military service revolver until 1892. The Colt Single Action Army has been offered in over 30 different calibers and various barrel lengths. Its overall appearance has remained consistent since 1873. Colt has cancelled its production twice, but brought it back due to popular demand. The revolver was popular with ranchers, lawmen, and outlaws alike, but as of the earliest 21st century, models are mostly bought by collectors and reenactors. Its design has influenced the production of numerous other models from other companies. The Colt Single Action Army Peacemaker revolver is a famous piece of Americana. The original length of the barrel, issued to the U.S. Cavalry, was 7.5 inches with an overall length of 13 inches. Bound by the Roland White patent, and not wanting to pay a royalty fee to Smith & Wesson, Colt could not begin development of bored-through revolver cylinders for metallic cartridge use until April 4, 1869. For the design, Colt turned to 2 of its best engineers, William Mason and Charles Brinkerhoff Richards, who had developed a number of revolvers and black powder conversions for the company. Their effort was designed for the United States government service revolver trials of 1872 by Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company and adopted as the standard military service revolver. Production began in 1873 with the Single Action Army Model 1873, also referred to as the New Model Army Metallic Cartridge Revolving Pistol. The very first production Single Action Army, serial number 1, thought lost for many years after its production, was found in a bar in Nashua, New Hampshire in the early 1900s. The gun was chambered in .45 Colt, a centerfire design containing charges of up to 40 grains or 2.6 grams of fine-grained black powder, and a 255 grain or 16.5 gram blunt round-nosed bullet. Relative to period charges and most later handgun rounds, it was quite powerful in its full loading. The Colt Single Action Army revolver, along with the 1870 and 1875 Smith & Wesson Model 3 Schofield revolver, replaced the 1860 Army percussion revolver. The Colt quickly gained favor over the Smith & Wesson and remained the primary U.S. military sidearm until 1892, when it was replaced by the .38 long Colt caliber Colt Model 1892, a double-action revolver with a swing-out cylinder. By the end of the 1874, serial number 16,000 was reached. 12,500 Colt Single-Action Army revolvers chambered for the .45 long Colt cartridge had entered service, and remaining revolvers were sold to the civilian market. Single Action Army became available in standard barrel lengths of 4 3/4 inch, 5.5 inch, as well as the cavalry standard original 7.5 inch. The shorter barreled revolvers are sometimes called the civilian or gunfighter models. This is in reference to the 4 3/4 inch model, and the artillery model, which is the 5.5 inch version. There was also a variant of the sub 4 inch barrel, without an ejector rod, unofficially called the Sheriff's model, the Banker's Special, or Storekeeper. From 1875 until 1880, Colt marketed a single action revolver in .44 rimfire Henry caliber in a separate number range from number 1 to 1863. A flat top target model was listed in Colt's catalogs from 1890 to 1898. Colt manufactured 914 of these revolvers with a frame that was flat on top and fitted with an adjustable leaf rear sight. The front sight consisted of a base and interchangeable blade. In 1896, at serial number 164,100, a spring-loaded base pin latch replaced the cylinder pin retaining screw, and by 1900, at serial number 192,000, the Colt Single Action was certified for use with smokeless powder. In 1920, larger, highly visible sights replaced the original thin blade and notch. The revolvers remained essentially unchanged from that point until cessation of manufacturing at the beginning of World War II. From 1873 through 1940, with the small numbers assembled during and after World War II, the so-called pre-war, post-war model, production of the Colt single-action army reached 357,859. This is identified as the pre-war or first generation of the model. Calibers, at least 30 in all, range from 22 rimfire through 4.676 Ellie, with approximately half 158,844, including Bisley and flat-top target variations chambered for 45 Colt. The next most prevalent were the 4440s, Winchester centerfires, at 71,392, 3840s at 50,520, 3220 Winchester at 43,284, and the 41 Colt at 19,676. All original, good condition U.S. cavalry and artillery single-action armies, which were those produced between 1873 and 1891, were among the most valuable to collectors, especially valuable, often going for well over $10,000, by the OWA, the Orville Wood Ainsworth, and the rare Henry Nettleton inspected single-action army Colts. The OWA Colt refers to the earliest issued single-action army guns, which were inspected by Orville W. Ainsworth. Ainsworth was the ordnance sub-inspector at the Colt factory for the first 13 months. This was from October 1873 to November 1874 of the single-action army's production. It was Ainsworth who inspected the Colts used by Colonel G.A. Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Battle of Little Bighorn. The number range of possible Little Bighorn Colts is 4,500 to 7,527. Henry Nettleton was the U.S. principal sub-inspector in 1878 at the Springfield Armory. Second only to the OWA Colts, Nettleton Colts are prized by serious collectors. Both the Nettleton and OWA Colts have the cartouche on the left side of the wood grip. In the mid-1870s, the Army had purchased a significant number of Smith & Wesson Schofield revolvers, chambering a shorter 45 round. Logistical problems arose because the ammunition was not interchangeable. The Colt revolvers would accept the shorter round, but not vice versa. For a time, the government stopped orders for the long Colt cartridge and used the Smith & Wesson round exclusively. The Schofield was soon retired and sold to the civilian market. The largest group of U.S. Colt cavalry revolvers was inspected by David F. Clark, his DFC cartouche being encountered on revolvers inspected from 1880 to 1887. During 1893, the 45 U.S. Colt single-action army revolver was retired by the cavalry and replaced with a 38 caliber Colt Model 1892 double-action army revolver. The 45 single-action army revolver was still standard issue to the infantry, artillery, and other branches of the U.S. Army. In 1895 and 1896, the U.S. federal government returned 2,000 single-action army revolvers to Colt to be refurbished. 800 were issued to the New York militia with a 7.5-inch barrel, and 1,200 were altered to a barrel length of 5.5 inches. In 1898, 14,900 of the single-action army revolvers were altered the same way by Springfield Armory. The original records of the War Department do refer to these revolvers with shortened barrels as the altered revolver. The name artillery is actually a misnomer, which Sapp speculates may have originated because the light artillery happened to have the first units armed with the altered revolver. The artillery single-action armies were issued to the infantry, the light artillery, the volunteer cavalry, and other troops because the standard issue 38 caliber Colt 1892 double-action revolver was lacking in stopping power. For that reason, the 45 artillery single-action army revolvers were used successfully by front troops in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders charged up San Juan Hill wielding the 45 caliber artillery model. The artillery model usually had mixed numbers. It can be identified by the US on the frame, the inspector stamps on different parts, such as a tiny A for Orville W. Ainsworth, DFC, HN, RAC for later inspectors, and K for replacement parts, and the cartouche of Ronaldo A. Carr, RAC, the inspector who inspected the refurbished guns on the grip. The Colt Frontier, or Frontier 6-shooter, was a Colt 1873 Model P type revolver manufactured in 4440 Winchester caliber instead of 45 Colt, so that it was compatible with Winchester Model 1873 ammunition. Production began in 1877. Colt Frontier 6-shooter was the actual name of the Colt pistol model, and this was acid etched onto the left side of the barrel. After 1889, the legend was roll stamped until 1919 when the caliber designation 4440 was added. Later Colt 1878 double-action Army models also wore this designation on the barrel when chambered in 44 WCF or 44 Winchester. The Bisley 1895 model was the final Colt to wear the Frontier 6-shooter designation. The 4440 was also promoted as the standard chambering for the new, hugely successful Winchester Model 1873 rifle. Users of the 44 Winchester cartridge in the far west appreciated the convenience of being able to carry a single caliber of ammunition, which they could fire in both revolver and rifle. The Colt Frontier 6-shooter revolver and the Winchester Model 1873 or the Winchester Model 1892 in 4440 WCF caliber were one of the most common combinations used in the Old West. For example, the two mounted cowboys at the gunfight at the OK Corral were armed with this rifle and pistol combination. 3840 and 3220, which is also 32 WCF, also qualify as frontier calibers because 1873 and 1892 Winchesters were made for these calibers, offering the same convenience as the 4440 caliber, namely using the same cartridge in both revolver and rifle. Colt Bisley was introduced in 1894 as a target pistol. The name Bisley came from the famous firing range in Bisley, England. The Colt Bisley can be distinguished by the longer grip, the wider hammer spur, and the wider trigger. The distinguishing feature of the Bisley target model is the top strap, which is flat and fitted with a sliding rear sight adjustable for windage only. The front sight is a removable blade which fits into the slotted base attached to the barrel. The revolvers were supplied with different blades for elevation. The Bisley mainspring is longer than the single-action Army mainspring, and the two are not interchangeable. It is attached to the hammer with a stirrup via a forked upper end. Serial numbers are stamped on the frame, the backstrap, and the trigger guard at the end of production with tiny dies. Bisleys were serial numbered in the range of 156,300 to 331,916. In the same sequence as the single-action Army. All Bisleys numbered after 161,376 had Bisley model, with the caliber stamped on the left side of the barrel, which is rare for older Colt revolvers. The most common calibers were 3220, 3840, 45 Colt, 4440, 41 Colt, and the British calibers 450 LE and 455 LE. A total number of 44,350 were manufactured. Production of the Bisley terminated in 1912, but serial number 331,916 was shipped after the First World War. Most Bisley standard model revolvers shipped to a United States address were not used for target shooting but for self-defense, because the grip and hammer were ideal for fast shooting. Surveys of existing Bisley show that a much larger number 4 3/4 inch Bisleys, perhaps as high as 62%, have survived as compared to the 5.5 inch and the 7.5 inch barreled guns. Considering the majority of Bisleys were made in 3220 and 3840, and some 60%, it appears that the market for single-action armies was changing. The late 1890s, with increased urbanization in the West, suggest the possibilities that many of these pistols were companions to the lever-action rivals of the same period, and that the low-slung hammer, less humped backstrap, and short barrel may have suited the city-dwelling, suit-coat-wearing clientele who still found themselves outdoors not only on horses but in buggies and automobiles. The need for man-stopping bullets was decreasing in urbanized environments, although in semi-urban areas, a pistol like the Bisley would be suitable for discouraging both four-legged and two-legged varmints, which also suitable for collecting supper along the road. The Bisley may mark a movement to a more civilized. Wyatt Earp biographer Stuart N. Lake popularized the myth of the Bluntline Special. In his highly fictionalized biography, Wyatt Earp Frontier Marshal, published in 1931, he wrote that Earp and four of the lawmen, Pat Masterson, Bill Tilghman, Charlie Bassett, and Neil Brown, were each presented with a customized revolver with a 12-inch long barrel. However, according to some other accounts, on October 26, 1881, the day of the gunfight at the OK Corral, Wyatt Earp carried an 1869 44 caliber Smith & Wesson model with an 8-inch barrel. At the beginning of World War II, Colt ceased production of the single-action Army revolver to devote more time to filling orders for the war. When the war ended, no plans were made to revive the single-action Army revolver, as its design was seen as obsolete. However, the advent of television and Western-themed movies created customer demand for the revolver. The Colt resumed manufacture in 1956 with a second-generation line of single-action Army revolvers. These second-generation Colt single-action Army revolvers were produced from 1956 to 1974 and carried serial numbers in the range of 0001 SA to 73205 SA. Due to the popularity of the television show The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, Colt introduced the aforementioned Bluntline Special as a second-generation offering from 1957 to 1974. 1961 to 1975, Colt offered an adjustable sight model known as the New Frontier, capitalizing on President John F. Kennedy's campaign slogan. Colt manufactured 4,200 of these revolvers, including 70 built on the Bluntline frame. The third generation began in 1976, characterized by a change in barrel thread pitch and a solid cylinder bushing, replacing the removable/replaceable parts in the first and second generations. This series ran until 1982 as a limited issue product with a serial number range of SA 80,000 to SA 99,999. In 1994, production of the single-action Army resumed with the increase in popularity of cowboy action shooting matches. These models are known as either as the late third generation or sometimes fourth generation. They have the original style, removable replaceable cylinder bushing. The serial numbers for this series start at S02001A and continue to use the S prefix and A suffix to 2009. Colt currently offers a single-action Army in one of two finishes, either an all-nickel or blued and colored case-hardened frame, in the traditional 3 barrel lengths, 4 3/4, 5.5, and 7.5 inch, with 8 chamberings, 3220, 3840, 4440, 38 Special, 357 Magnum, 44 Special, 45 Colt, or 45 ACP, with a total of 42 variations. Colt manufactured third-generation Buntlines and New Frontiers through the Colt Custom Shop, as well as many engraved pistols. In 2010, Colt released a revival of the Frontier 6-shooter with a nickel finish. Starting in 1999, Colt began manufacturing a version of the single-action Army revolver with a modern transfer bar safety, allowing it to be carried with the hammer resting on a loaded chamber. The Colt Cowboy, as it was named, was designed to be more affordable than the single-action Army. It was offered with barrel lengths of 4.75 inches, 5.5 inches, and 7.5 inches. 7.5 variant was discontinued in 1999, as was the 4.75-inch variant, which was reintroduced in 2002. Manufacturing for the Colt Cowboy was discontinued in 2003. Colt engraved about 1% of its first-generation production of the single-action Army revolver, which makes these engraved models extremely rare and valuable with collectors. Engraved pieces were often ordered for or by famous people of the day, including lawmen, heads of states, and captains of industry. This tradition began with the founder, Samuel Colt, who regularly gave such examples away as a means for publicity for Colt. Colt employed a number of engravers, many of whom were trained artisans who emigrated from Europe. These artisans, such as Gustav Jung, Kuno A. Helfrich, Rudolf J. Kohnbrath, and Louis Daniel Nimschke, were known for inlaying gold, silver, and precious stones into their work. Many of these engraved pieces were adorned with stocks made of ivory or pearl, with engravings and inlays as well. About 400 of the second-generation single-action armies were manufactured and engraved by Colt. The factory engravers of the period were Alvin Herbert, Earl Beer, Dennis Class, Robert Burt, Keith Kemick, and Leonardo Francione. One of those most sought-after engravers who have worked on Colt revolvers was Alvin White, at the shop of AA White Engraving. The single-action army is a refinement of the earlier Colt percussion revolvers and the Colt 1871 cartridge revolver. The cylinder is mounted on a central axis and operated by a hand with a double finger, whose more extended action allowed the cylinder ratchet to be cut in a larger circle, giving more torsional force to the cylinder. 4 notches on the face of the hammer engage the rear portion of the trigger, supporting 5 basic hammer positions. The hammer, when fully rested, rests within the frame. Drawn slightly to the rear, the hammer engages the safety notch of the sear and holds the firing pin out of direct contact with the chambered cartridge. Like the earlier percussion revolvers, the single-action army was designed to allow loading of all the chambers. The safety notch replaced pins on the rear of the percussion revolver cylinders, which served the same purpose as the safety position, by preventing hammer contact with the primer percussion cap. However, many users adopted the practice of leaving one chamber empty under the hammer, because a sharp blow could damage the mechanism and allow a fully loaded revolver to fire. This practice is now universally recommended. Drawn back about halfway, the hammer engages the second notch. This cams the cylinder bolt out of engagement and allows the cylinder to rotate for loading. Fully cocked, the revolver is ready to fire. Cartridge ejection is via the spring-loaded rod housed in a tube on the right side of the barrel. The loading sequence is as follows. Place the revolver on half cock and open the loading gate to the side. Load each chamber in sequence, setting the hammer in the safety notch when finished, or load one more chamber, skip the next, loading the 4 remaining chambers. Close the loading gate, draw the hammer to full cock and fully lower, making sure that the firing pin is over the empty chamber. Firing the revolver is accomplished by drawing the hammer to full cock and pulling the trigger. The hammer must be manually cocked for each shot. It is possible to fire the single-action armor rapidly by holding down the trigger and fanning the hammer with the other hand. Ed McGivern dispelled the myth of the inaccuracy of this procedure by shooting tight groups while fanning the revolver. By 1878, the Colt single-action army was being offered from the factory in additional calibers for civilian and foreign military sales. Many were sold in 44-40 Winchester center fire, introduced in 1878 to allow cross-compatibility with the Winchester's 1873 lever-action rifle. This model was called the Colt Frontier 6-shooter, and was etched and later rolled stamped on the left side of the barrel. Additional period calibers for the single-action army included 38-40 Winchester, introduced in 1884, the 32-20 Winchester, introduced in 1884, the 41 Colts, introduced in 1885, the 38 Long Colts in 1887, the 38 Special, and the 357 Magnum in the 20th century. Some of the separately serialized 44 Henry rimfire revolvers were chambered to 22 rimfire after 1885. The single-action army at one time or another was offered in dozens of calibers from 22 rimfire to 476 Ellie. Through the 45 Colt has always been the most common. Scaled-down 22 rimfire version was called the Scout or Frontier Scout, was available in the late 20th century. The first Colt single-action army prototypes were manufactured in 44 American caliber for the 1872 government trials, as the 44 American was the cartridge used in the 1000 Smith & Wesson Model 3 revolvers issued to the troops. After the test, the Colt was declared the superior revolver, and the government specified that a 45 caliber cartridge would be required. With the adoption of the Colt single-action army revolver in 1873, the service cartridges were copper-cased, 45 centerfire Benet, inside primed Colt revolver cartridges loaded with 30 grains of black powder and an inside lubricated bullet of 250 grains. They were manufactured at Frankfurt Arsenal, Philadelphia, through 1874. In 1875, the cartridge was shortened so that it would also function with the newly adopted Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver. It was designated revolver cartridge and loaded with 28 grains of black powders and a bullet of 230 grains. The Benet primed cartridges were manufactured until 1882 and then replaced by reloadable cartridges with brass cases and external primers. The original 45 Colt black powder loads of 40 grains propelled a 250 to 255 grain bullet at a nominal 970 feet per second, or 300 meters per second. Authors John Taffin and Mike Venturino have demonstrated that modern black powder loadings of the 45 Colt cartridge frequently achieve velocities in the vicinity of 1,000 feet per second, with the 7.5-inch cavalry barrel length, even though modern solid head cases made it impossible to load 40 full grains. Specifications for 20th century smokeless loads set velocities with a 255 grain, round-nosed, flat-point bullet at 870 feet per second, 270 meters per second, providing 429 foot-pound force, or 582 joules of energy. The version of the 45 Colt, as of 2014, differs from the original cartridge case in that the rim is significantly larger, with a groove immediately above it, and the internal aspect of the primer pocket is surrounded by brass instead of protruding into the powder chamber. This solid head case is stronger and resists deformation of the primer pocket. Some commercial and custom revolvers and single-shot pistols, such as the Ruger Blackhawk, the TNC Contender, and others, employ high-pressure loads that are dangerous in the single-action army and other vintage arms chambered for the 45 Colt cartridge, especially 19th century pre-smokeless revolvers, which should be fired, if at all, with black powder only. Prior to World War II, the 45 Colt used a groove diameter of .454. Post-World War II production adopted the 452 groove diameter of the 45 ACP. ACP standing for Automatic Colt Pistol. From 1924 through 1940, a small number of single actions in the pistol caliber 45 ACP were produced. Colt's record lists several single-action armies chambered for the 45 Colt cartridge and being accompanied by an extra cylinder for the 45 ACP. The power, accuracy, and handling qualities of the single-action army made it a popular sidearm from its inception, well into the 20th century. The association with the history of the American West remains to the present century, and these revolvers remain popular with shooters and collectors. George S. Patton, who began his career in the Horse Cavalry, carried a custom-made single-action army with ivory grips, engraved with his initials and an eagle, which became his trademark. He used it during the Mexican punitive expedition of 1916, killed 2 Pancho Villa's lieutenants, and carried it until his death in 1945, shortly after the end of World War. In the early and mid-20th century, original peacemakers lacking historical provenance and not in pristine condition were not particularly valuable. They served as raw material for early enthusiasts such as Elmer Keith, Harold Croft, and R.F. Sedgley, who modified the revolvers to enhance performance and experimented with more effective ammunition. At the beginning of the 21st century, first and second generation single-action armies are highly regarded as collector's items and often considered too valuable to shoot. After World War II, new interest in the single-action army started, and firearms enthusiast William R. Wilson recognized a need and opportunity. In 1853, Wilson founded the Great Western Arms Company to produce an almost exact clone of the old Colt single-action army for television and movie westerns. The Great Western revolvers were manufactured in Los Angeles. Later Colt editions are more common, and various copies and near copies of the revolver are made by Uberti of Italy. Uberti is now owned by Beretta, producer of the Beretta Stampede, American manufacturers including Colt Manufacturing Company, which still retains the model in its catalog. Until its dissolution in 2017, U.S. Firearms Manufacturing Company built several variations due to the original first and second generation specifications. STI International still introduced a very precisely made single-action army with a modified hand spring assembly designed to long last to the original. The single-action army is the precursor and inspiration for modern sporting revolvers from John Limbaugh, Freedom Arms, Ruger, Cimarron, and others. In 2010, Arizona State Rifle and Pistol Association President Noble C. Hathaway and Cast Bullet Director Dan Walliser surveyed state residents to determine what Old West firearm should be named the official state firearm. The Colt Patent Firearms Single-Action Army won by a 38% margin. Soon afterwards, Hathaway submitted a bill to the Arizona legislature, and on the last day of the 2010-2011 regular legislative session, Arizona Senate Bill 1610 was passed. Within days, Governor Jan Brewer signed the bill into law. Arizona is the second state to have an official firearm, following Utah's adoption of the Colt M1911 pistol.
On a tree frog, it's ordeal, the trial to survive.